Hi everybody, I'm Professor Rad, and today we're going to create a bar graph. So let's first define what a bar graph is, and then we'll create one. A bar graph is a way of presenting how often values occur in a data set, where the height of each bar that you use tells you how often that it happened. You can make a bar graph for either numerical data or non-numerical data. So both types of data can be presented in a bar graph. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a bar graph for a frequency distribution that we created in the last video. So let me pull up my graphing space here. And this is my frequency distribution. I cut it out from my notes earlier. Please don't do that with your notes. But I did that so we can see it a little bit more easily. So when I create a bar graph, I like to set things up first before I, finalize the picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my vertical axis first, and then I'll set up my horizontal axis, and then we can go ahead and create the bars. So to create my vertical axis, I like to look at the range of values that I have and come up with a good kind of numbering system. So my numbers here, the smallest number is a 1 and the biggest number is a 15. So if I count each of these lines by 1, like if this is 0 and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't get up to 15. So that's not a good way to do it. So let's try counting by 2s. Let's see if that works. So if this is 0, we would have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. And 16 is close to 15, but bigger than it. So that sounds like a good way to number this. So I'm going to number 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. And that means that each of these lines in between is going to represent just a unit of 1. And then I also have to tell everyone looking at this what these numbers represent, because they could represent frequencies, but they could also represent like percentages or other kinds of amounts. So since this category is titled frequency, that's what I'm going to label this axis with. Then I'm going to do the same thing across the bottom. So here I have 5 different housing types as my categories. So I'm going to write each of those housing types where these lines are. So I'm going to have campus, parents, rent, own, and other. And just like I could use frequency to guide me in labeling this axis, I'm going to use housing type as how I label this axis down here. So this is my housing type. And then lastly, before I create the bars of my bar graph, I want to give my graph a title so that people who look at my graph know what data they're looking at. So in this example, this was a survey of 30 students that asked them, where do you live? So I want to create a title that represents that. So I could say housing for students. I could call it survey of 30 students. I'm going to, how am I going to call this? I'm going to call this, probably housing for students. I was considering, living situation for students. That would also be fine. So you want something relevant, but also fairly concise. All right, now we can go ahead and draw each of the bars. So to draw the bars of our bar graph, what I'm going to do is my bars are going to be 2 spaces wide because that's the space that's provided to me on this graph. Sometimes it would just be 1 space wide. So you kind of want to plan out where you want to put things. I'm going to use red just so that it shows up better against this grid. Black would be very difficult to see. So for the campus, it had a frequency of 7. So 7 is halfway between 6 and 8. So the campus line has to go up to there. And then I'm going to draw the sides down on either end. Then for my bar graph, I'm going to skip some space. That's important. For our bar graph, we're going to skip space between our bars. And then I'm going to draw the bar for the parents. So the parents went up to 15. So let's see, that's going to be here, because 15 is halfway between 14 and 16. There we go. Then we have 4 people rented. So for renting, we go up to 4. 3 people owned. And 1 person had other. There you go. So we've created our bars here. So when I ask you to create a bar graph, this is what I require from you. But there are 2 things you can do that are optional to make your graph a little bit easier to read. So one way is, if you still have trouble seeing these lines, if they're not a different color, or if you're just using pencil, you can shade in the bars, or kind of use stripes like this, so that we can see that bar stand out a little bit better. So coloring in the bars is not a requirement for me, but it's an optional feature. The other thing that's optional is you could give data labels to these. So that's especially useful if we had to do a little bit more approximating with the heights of our bars. In this case, each bar landed on a line. That doesn't necessarily always happen. So if I have to kind of guess where the height is, it's helpful to write on top of the bar what value we were going for. So for example, if it was like 4.3%, I would draw it just a little bit above the 4 line, and so I would write 4.3% there. Now, before we wrap up, there is one more thing that I've been noticing more and more often in recent years, so I do want to point it out. A common mistake with creating a bar graph that tends to happen in this first axis is miscounting or mislabeling this vertical axis. So for example, sometimes I'll see like a 1 down here. So there would be like a 1, 2, 4, 6. Or I might see something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10. So suddenly, instead of counting by 1s, it changes to counting by 2s. So when you create your axis, you want to keep that frequency consistent. So here, every time I counted, it was by going by 2s. So if I start at 0, I have to go up to 2, and then 4, and so on. I don't want to start at 1 because I need to make sure that there's some bar here for this value of 1. So I do want to start at 0. I want to start before the smallest number, and I want to end after the highest number. Okay, so it was good that this ended at 16 because that gave me space to show this bar for 15. In the next video, we're going to talk about a special variation on this type of bar graph that is nice for numerical data. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.